Bon dia a tothom. On behalf of the organizers of this event and on behalf of the Centre de Lingüística Teòrica at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Noam Chomsky and all of you to this dialogue with him. The organization of this event will be as follows. First, Professor Joan Mascaró will introduce Professor Noam Chomsky, and then Professor Eulàlia Bonet will read aloud some of the questions that different members and associates of our research center, the CLT, have sent to the organizers for this occasion. Let me say that the organizers of this event are very grateful to the CLT members and associates for their collaboration and for their having thought up so many interesting questions. Professor Chomsky received them as they were originally formulated by our colleagues, but now, for reasons of space, some of these questions you will see on the screen in the PowerPoint have been shortened, have been reduced. And finally, let me point out that this event is expected to last until 1:30, more or less. Okay, so now Professor Joan Mascaró, Professor of Catalan Philology and member of the CLT, will introduce Professor Noam Chomsky.
Okay, I'm going to just say a few words, and I mean, it's almost impossible to introduce our speaker. I mean, maybe if he was introducing me, he might say something new or something interesting, but not the other way around. And I'll just say that we are very thankful for your willingness to share some of your time with us, and we are very thankful in general for the time you devote, not just by doing your work, but sharing directly with people following Bertrand Russell's words, are some of the main passions that have govern your life. And thank you very much.
La primera pregunta, question one, says the following. Joint research of linguists and experts from other fields, biology, physics, etc., should help us understand the faculty of language better. However, in practice, such cooperation seems not to be feasible for various reasons. Do you think that relevant questions about the faculty of language can still be asked and pursued with the theoretical tools that have been used in generative grammar? This question is perhaps particularly relevant for young linguists.
My own feeling is that the current period is one in which these connections and contacts can flourish to an extent that has not been possible before. For one thing, it's now 50 years, almost exactly, since Eric Lenneberg published his, by now, classic work that founded biology of language, what later came to be called biolinguistics. That was a major contribution, set in motion lots of research. A great deal has been learned about language. The techniques of psychological experimentation have become far more sophisticated. Just in very recent years, largely thanks to new technology, there's been a very exciting work going on in neurolinguistics, which is beginning to connect in quite interesting ways with crucial issues in the study of language. I could give many examples, but I don't see why. If in practice cooperation seems to be not feasible, I think that's a failure of the individuals involved. The fields are certainly ready for close integration and achievement. on the 50th anniversary of Eric Lenneberg's book, there's a new book coming out by Angela Frederici, which is a major summary of mostly recent work on neurolinguistics. It's a very impressive array of materials that couldn't have been imagined a few years ago. And her own ideas are also quite striking, including an effort to demonstrate that quite specific sub-areas, sub-regions in general Broca's area and their connection through white matter, which hadn't been investigated before, a dorsal path to a posterior temporal region. Apparently, considerable evidence that that's the locus of the special capacity of adult humans to develop and comprehend and produce complex hierarchical syntactic structures and interpret them. And there's even evidence that the increase in myelination of these fibers corresponds to ontogenetically in development to growth to increase in the capacity, observed capacity with psycholinguistic techniques in analyzing and comprehending and internalizing complex linguistic structures. That's, if it can be sustained, it's a really substantial breakthrough in attempts to relate the neural basis for language to specific and quite intricate linguistic capacities. There's other work. So, for example, the studies in another domain, the studies of Ross Thornton on the what's called the continuity assumption, the idea that children simply progress. Basically, they must start with not knowing what language is the local language, and they simply explore the range of possible languages as data comes in to converge on specific class of languages. Charles Yang has done quite interesting work on this. Ross Thornton's work is particularly interesting in that she's been investigating how children produce spontaneously expressions which conform to languages other than the local language, which they've never heard evidence about. So children who produce long-distance WH questions in the manner of some, say, German dialects with an element left in at the successive positions. Of course, they never heard it. Though children apparently don't produce innovative sentences that don't conform to universal grammar principles that are exemplified elsewhere. A work of that kind is extremely interesting. A couple of years ago, some of the most exciting work that I know of came out in connecting these fields. One of the critical questions about the general architecture of language, a general question is, to what extent does the externalization process, the mapping of internal syntactic structures to some sensory modality, typically speech, though as we know now, it doesn't have to be speech, could be sign, could be touch. To what extent this externalization is appended to the internal language system that yields syntax, semantics, interpretation at the what's called the conceptual intentional interface, and to what extent the externalization actually feeds processes internal to the core semantic syntactic processes. A strong thesis is that it doesn't feed it at all, that it's ancillary, that the properties of externalization simply do not enter into syntax and semantics. So, for example, linear order, which doesn't appear to play any role, or maybe it can be argued plays no role in the syntactic and semantic processes, but is of course required by sensory modalities. So for speech, it has to be linear. For sign, there's a number of other options because of the nature of modality. Some of these things were explored by Pim Leveld years ago, the differences between the modalities. But now there's a serious question. It's important, critically important for the general architecture of language, as to whether the externalization system is completely separate from the core syntactic semantic processes. And as many of you know, there have been quite interesting psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic inquiries that shed considerable light on this question. It began with the work of Neil Smith and Ianthe Tsimple on a subject who they call Chris, who's cognitively extremely limited, very limited cognitive capacities, but quite extraordinary linguistic capacities. He can pick up languages very quickly, though he doesn't really understand anything. He can't remember how to get to his bedroom, for example. But they began to investigate how Chris would react to invented languages that of two types, one type that conformed to UG principles, another that used principles that arguably are not available to UG, like linear order. So for example, if you construct an artificial language in which negation works the way it does in, say, Italian, and another language in which negation uses the much simpler rule of placing the negative particle, say, at the third word of the sentence. It's a trivial computational rule. The actual rules of language are much more complex. So when you present Chris, this subject, with the two types of invented language, how would he react? Their prediction, which in fact was verified, was that he would be completely unable to deal with the language with the simple computational procedure using linear order, but would master easily the invented language that conformed to standard, that in fact was exemplified in other languages and conformed to UG principles. They then studied, and that worked out as they expected, they then studied the same question with normals and had a very interesting result, which hasn't been pursued more fully, though it would be quite important to try to do so. Their preliminary result was that normals could relatively easily deal with the language that conformed to UG principles. The one that involved linear order, they could handle if it was presented to them as a puzzle, but they couldn't handle if it was presented to them as a language, as if the set that was established by establishing the conditions of the experiment determined whether the linguistic system was going to operate or other cognitive systems were going to operate. These are preliminary results which would be very interesting to pursue. The model was suggested to Andrea Moro, many of you know, to initiate neurolinguistic studies. And they carried them out in Milan. They've since been replicated many times. It looks quite solid. What they found essentially is that with normals, in the same conditions, if you present an invented language which conforms to UG, modeled in fact on some language that none of them knew, then you got normal activity in Broca's area. If you presented the non-linguistic example, say negation being the third word, or using linear order in other ways, you got diffuse activity in many parts of the brain, indicating that the people are somehow trying to solve a puzzle, not treating it as a language. That's quite interesting. All of this supports the conclusion that in the architecture of the linguistic system, there's a fundamental break between internal computation and externalization. It could turn out to be the case. It's a far-reaching thesis that I think we're finding evidence for, that the internal system is close to uniform among languages. There's very little variation among it, maybe none if we ever learn enough. And that the apparent complexity and variety and easy mutability of languages, quick changes and so on, are properties of the externalization system. And the externalization system you would expect to be complex because it's trying to relate two systems that have nothing to do with one another. The internal linguistic system, which I think there's reason to believe evolved pretty recently and suddenly in human evolution, and sensory motor systems which had been in place for hundreds of thousands of years and have nothing special to do with language, like gesture, vocalization, and so on. So matching these two systems is, of course, raises many complexities, and it could be that that's the locus of apparent linguistic complexity and variety. There's some similar observations that can be made, I think, about the nature of lexical meaning, word meaning, which in deep respect seems to be in complex ways common to languages and universal, while there are external, peripheral aspects that vary through cultural effects. Well, this is just a barest sample, but indications of the kind of work that can be done integrating the psycholinguistic experimentation, which is by now quite sophisticated, neurolinguistic work, which can be carried out in ways that wouldn't have been imagined a couple of years ago with more sophisticated technology and experimental sophistication and in advances, I think, in straight linguistic analysis that tend to lead to particular conclusions about the architecture of language. If these things can be made to converge, it becomes quite exciting prospects open. And all of these things open many avenues for inquiry and research. So my own feeling about the question is that we're right in a position now which we were not 50 years ago when Eric wrote his book, to carry forward the kinds of inquiries that he contemplated, that many of us thought about, but couldn't really be carried forward at that time. Now should be able to. If there are difficulties in pursuing it, it's a problem of academic inefficiency, separation of academic departments, which shouldn't take place, separation of professions, which tends to happen in the academic world, but shouldn't. And great progress, I think, can be made by overcoming these barriers and pursuing the opportunities that are now available for quite serious and far-reaching research. So, for example, if it could be established, as many of these results seem to indicate, that the continuity hypothesis, what Thornton, Crane, and others are investigating, can be established, that children are simply following a path dictated by UG principles and exploring the range of possible languages and converging on their own. If, furthermore, we can establish or even approach conclusions of the depth of what I suggested, that the externalization systems are tacked on to the core linguistic processes but don't interact with them, these would have far-reaching effects on the descriptive study of language, on historical linguistics, on dialect studies, on many other fields. So that looks to me like a period of very rich prospects, a time when it's very good to be a young student.
So question 2. Interdisciplinary approaches seem to be necessary these days. In such context, much theoretical research takes into account psycho and neurolinguistic experiments and other types of evidence. This brings back the possibility to incorporate usage-based approaches to language with tools, statistical analyses, corpus-based research, etc., that are not always backed up with theoretically sound research questions. What is your perspective on this matter?
Usage-based approaches, as they're called, are very tempting. They don't require knowing anything, which is always easy. You can collect, with contemporary technology, you can collect huge amounts of data, you know, billions of bits of data, store them in your computer. You can do some elementary statistical analysis, come up with some correlations, this and that. It requires very little thought, very little understanding. The approaches basically assume that there's nothing to learn, that there are no principles, there's no general theories, it's just, say, language acquisition is basically a matter of memorization. You memorize structures, you make minimal generalizations, and you're all done. Nothing general to say about languages. It's just a lot of collection of data. So it's very tempting. It's easy to do. You can get a lot of money for it. Google is willing to pour tons of money into it. A lot of jobs, incidentally, if you just want to collect data and organize it. So there's a lot of temptations to support usage-based approaches, and for that reason they're very popular. The question is, does anything come out of them? Well, it's pretty hard to find anything. There have been some careful attempts to try to analyze the claims that are made within these approaches. The most comprehensive I know are by Stephen Crane, who's had, he and his associates, Ross Thornton, a couple of others, have done pretty close analyses of the proposals that have been made. Robert Berwick, my colleague, and I and others have investigated the proposals to deal with there's one topic that has been the focus of more attention within all of these approaches than any other. That's the question of structure dependence of rules. And we went through the various attempts to show you that you could account for these in statistical terms, and everyone is not only a total failure, but they would be a failure even if they succeeded, because they're all asking the wrong question. They're all asking the question, how could a speaker of a child, an English-speaking child, learn that, say, in auxiliary inversion, you move the structurally highest auxiliary and not the linearly closest auxiliary. Even if you could show that there's a way of doing that, which you can't, it would tell you 0, because the only question is, why is it universally the case? Why doesn't the next language do it a different way? That's the question. And even if you could, which apparently is quite impossible, show it for a particular language, it would be of no significance whatsoever. It would be a kind of amusing footnote. So all the work is totally beside the point. It's asking the wrong question and cannot get anywhere with the question it is asking. Crane has gone through many other proposals about binding theory, many others, and everyone collapses totally. So my feeling is, despite the popularity, nothing comes out of it, except useful devices, like a Google Translator. It's kind of useful. It's based on nothing but association among correlations that you can find among millions of words. Yeah, you can find things and it tells you something, but it's kind of good to have. If you want to understand roughly what might be said in some article in Greek. You can stick it in and so on. So it's like having a better bulldozer. That's a good thing. If you want to build a road, it's nice to have a big bulldozer. But it's of no scientific interest that I can see. And though I'm sure this is going to continue to be very popular for the reasons I mentioned, it's intellectually almost vacuous. You don't have to know anything. And it's in principle vacuous because the claim is there's nothing to know. There are no principles. There are no uniform things. There's a ton of money behind it because you can get moderately useful devices. The technology is simple, accumulate huge amounts of data, do elementary statistical analysis. So it's plenty of jobs. So it's bound to be a major field. But my feeling is when the way the question is put, I think, gets to the point, understated when it says not always backed up by theoretically sound research questions. I think the right way to put it is never backed up by theoretically sound research questions. That's a pretty strong statement, and I would suggest that you challenge it to show that I'm wrong. But I think that would be the fair statement. That's, anyway, asks what my perspective is on the matter, and that's what it is.
So many people would say, Professor Chomsky, Manolo Martinez here. Many people would say that that machine learning kind of approach by Google and others would eventually uncover complicated nonlinear relations, which are in the data, which are not just merely correlational information, but something more sophisticated that might map in complicated ways to the kind of theoretical structures that you and others favor. Do you think that's a correct perspective or totally misguided?
Sorry, I don't hear very well. Did you capture?
I can go again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe if you can.
Right. So I was just asking whether, so many people would say that machine learning approaches to language comprehension would uncover nonlinear relations in the data that would eventually map onto the kinds of theoretical structures that you and others favor. So the idea would be that kind of statistical correlation is not at all simple, it's actually extremely sophisticated. It might be another way of getting at the same kind of hidden structure.
Machine, like neural net type theories,
Sure.
deep learning.
Kinds of things that Google does in general.
Well, I mean, you can't say in advance that nothing can come out of this. And in fact, some things do come out. There are things you can do with what's called deep learning, complex neural net systems with many layers and so on and so forth. So, for example, one thing that's done extensively is image recognition. If you put in billions of examples, and you always have to have tutorials. So you have to have human tutorials helping, picking things and so on. Then it turns out you can finally, after a long period of time, get a pretty good capacity for the machine learning to distinguish this from this, say, which could be useful for many purposes. Now the next question is, and this has been pursued, can we account for word learning this way, the way children learn words, by saying, well, they just have billions of exposures to various images, and there's some kind of reinforcement that picks things out. And the answer is, I think, there's an answer at two levels. The one level is it can't be right because that's not what children do. They're learning words at about 1 an hour during meeting on one presentation during the peak periods of learning, and not hundreds of millions of examples and tutorials. And parents' reactions have apparently almost no effect. They just pick them up automatically. That's one level of answer. A deeper level of analysis of answer is it cannot work in principle. And it cannot work in principle because of the nature of word meaning. Human language differs from every known animal communication system in many ways, but one of the ways is that the lexical atoms, the word-like atom elements that are the minimal meaning-bearing elements, simply do not have the properties of what's called referentialism, picking out an extra-mental entity. Every word, this is understood already in classical Greece, every word, the meaning of every word is in part determined by internal mental processes. So this thing is a cup, not just because of the way it looks, but because of the way it was designed, the way it's used, characteristically, other aspects that Aristotle called form, as distinct from matter, which are internal properties attributed to things by the mind. And no matter how much image recognition you do, you're never going to find this, because you're looking under the wrong lamppost. The meaning is in part determined by the way in which humans automatically, reflexively interpret an object as a so-and-so because of features like design, intention, characteristic use, and so on, which you can't see, which a physicist can't find. It's not in the extra-mental world. So it's going to fail in principle from the beginning. Actually, this bears on the question that I mentioned before of whether there are going to be, we're going to discover someday, universal properties of word meaning, which are invariant and are only modified slightly in actual languages by peripheral elements of cultural accident. And it probably will turn out to be true for just these reasons. Now, these intrinsic properties of lexical meaning are universal. So every language has them. Children just, they don't learn them. That's part of what they bring to the analysis of language, very much like syntactic principles. I suspect that's what we're going to find. So going back to deep learning, there are things that can be done in a manner which is radically different from anything that a human does. But I don't think they're aiming at the wrong target. And I think you can see in advance why they will have to fail, no matter how complex and sophisticated they get. That they're aiming at a target that's here, but the actual target is over here. You know?
So isn't a more parsimonious and more biologically sound hypothesis to suggest that language qua organ may be a variational modality in the sense of Wagner 2014, of some already existing organ with homologues in other extinct or extant species, possibly serving different functions from communication or thought?
Well, frankly, I don't think the question arises. It's like asking, say, if you're a chemist in the 18th century, and somebody said, say at the time when Dalton's theories of chemical structure were being developed, and someone argued, as in fact some people did, wouldn't it be more parsimonious if instead of all of these complex notions you're introducing, like a nucleus and electrons and so on, you could just do it on the basis of Newton's laws, period, like objects in motion, like the planets? Wouldn't that be more parsimonious? It doesn't mean anything. The question is, what are the facts? Is it a fact that chemical reactions can be accounted for simply by Newton's laws? Or are there special laws of chemistry that we have to discover that have to do with the nature of the intrinsic nature of matter? That's the question. There's no question of parsimony. So in this case, the question should be reframed, I think, as asking, are there homologies with other species? If they are, what are they? Well, the answer, I think, is that human language seems to be unique in fundamental respects. There doesn't seem to be anything analogous or even homologous in other species. Actually, going back to Lenneberg's book, that was one of the fundamental things he was trying to argue, expressing the general views of the day among the small group of us who were interested in these topics, not very many, but it seemed to us apparent from the earliest days of generative grammar in the 1950s that when you looked at the structure of language, you were finding properties that had no analogy elsewhere in the animal world. And that's at a very fundamental level. So for example, the simple fact that language involves discrete infinity, most trivial thing you can think of about language. So there's 6-word sentences and 7-word sentences, but no 6.5-word sentences. And it goes on indefinitely. That property of discrete infinity is very rare in the biological world. If you look at, say, animal communication systems, they're either finite, like a monkey's calls. You know, a monkey can have half a dozen calls, or they're continuous, like the famous waggle dance of bees, determining distance, height, orientation of, say, a flower, which can, in principle, can vary continuously insofar as any physical system can be continuous. You find one or the other, but no discrete infinity. In fact, down to the level of DNA, there doesn't seem to be any other discrete infinite system in the biological world. And as you go on, take, say, word meaning, it seems to be completely different from animal communication systems. The calls of a monkey do satisfy the referential criterion. So a vervet monkey, for example, has, say, half a dozen calls. If leaves are moving in a certain way, the vervet monkey reflexively produces a certain call, which we interpret as being a warning call, meaning maybe there's an eagle coming by or something. But and as far as is known, every symbol in animal communication systems is of this type. And as you go on to hierarchic structure, binding theory, anything else you look at, there simply is nothing homologous. It seems to be a fact. One of the things that Lenneberg discussed in his book, which is the first real effort to have a comprehensive approach to this, is the plausibility of discontinuity in evolution. It's not like what you learn in elementary school, that everything happens by small changes. There are sharp changes that can take place that lead to small changes in genetic structure that can yield huge phenomenal differences. Lenneberg's book was actually written at the time when there were only the earliest understanding of this. Right at the time he was writing, the 1960s, Monod and Jacob had discovered the role of regulatory genes in controlling complex arrays of genetic processes, and began to understand that small changes in regulatory circuits could lead to huge phenomenal changes. The way Jacob put it in his work, popular work, the difference between, say, an elephant and a fly could be the result of a small, very small modification in the circuits of regulatory genes that control a variety of a range of other genes. That leads to sharp discontinuities and phenomenal, what we see among phenotypes, though with small genetic variations. And that makes plausible what appears to be the case, makes biologically plausible what appears to be the case descriptively, that human language just is radically different from other systems, that in just about every dimension you can think of. If what I said before about the distinction between externalization and internal processing turns out to be correct, and my own feeling is there's mounting evidence for it that would show that there's another fundamental distinction. In animal communication systems, it's all externalization. There's essentially nothing else. And they are used for communication. Human language doesn't seem to have those properties. There's an internal system which is common to both production and perception, to both input and output. They both access a common knowledge base, and communication. Of course, you can communicate with language, but that has nothing special to do with its architecture. And in just about every dimension you look at, a human language just seems to be a very special, unique development. And it's not surprising if you look at the nature of human beings in the biological world, there's just nothing remotely like human beings, for all kind of obvious reasons. Other animals aren't having this discussion, for example, or doing anything. Other animals don't have responsibilities. We do, and everywhere you look, it's just a totally different species in every imaginable respect, and most of it probably traces back to language, which yielded capacities that other organisms just don't have. As you know, from the 1970s on, there have been extensive efforts to try to show that other organisms, typically apes, can have some rudiments of human language. The major project was the NIM project, organized by Herb Terrace and others. Every single one has been a total failure. You simply cannot get an otherwise intelligent ape that has about the same auditory system that humans have to get anywhere in acquiring the most elementary rudiments of language with the most elaborate training, efforts to duplicate the environment of a child. Nothing goes anywhere. They simply lack these capacities. Just as you couldn't train humans to carry out to duplicate the navigational capacities of ants. They're way more sophisticated than we are. We just don't have the capacity to do it. Or the waggle dance of bees. Let's say no matter how much you trained a human, they could never do that. We're just not built for it. And other animals don't seem to be built for having anything like language, as far as we know. I don't think the question really is, would it be more parsimonious, but is it true? Is it a fact? It seems not to be.
Perdó, si pot ser ben breu i ben precisa, perquè tenim problemes de...
Sergio Galante. I agree with you that the question is about homology, but the problem is that uniqueness claims cannot be equated with absence of homology. A unique character may be just unique, but it may have homologies. Think about flight in bats. This is an automorphy, so it's unique in bats, but bats' wings exist as homologs in any vertebrate living. The problem is that just equating uniqueness with absence of homology. I think this is wrong. So it is not the, it may not be true. It might not be true. Maybe it's true.
Yes, could you? Okay, just wait a second.
That's it. Uniqueness with the absence of homology, is that a key? Because it doesn't,
just doesn't necessarily mean that there is no homology, because some characters are unique, like flight in bats, but still the structures that allow flight in bats are homologous to any vertebrate limb. So you cannot jump from uniqueness, which is basically a taxonomic or phylogenetic notion, to homology or absence of it. So you can always leave open the possibility that some homology exists independently of uniqueness. So language is unique, sorry.
There could be commonalities underlying apparent variety. So even if you had something unique, two things that are unique, they might have common features at some level. Is that the point? Well, that's certainly true. I mean, bees and humans have essentially the same DNA, you know. If you take a cell, you just look at a cell from a fungus and a human, unless you're a highly skilled biologist, you can't see any difference between them. Eukaryotic cells look uniform across the whole animal world. So yes, there are deep commonalities, but it doesn't change the fact that a fungus and a human are very different objects.
What do you think about the cartographic project? To what extent is it compatible with your views?
Well, my views don't really matter, but I think the right question is, what do we think about the cartographic project? Say, Cinque's work. One is, it's very fascinating material. Cinque, Rizzi, others have discovered some quite remarkable facts. If you look at Cinque's extensive, rich cartography of adverbial positions, it's remarkable that languages should conform to this apparently quite complex structure. And he's got plenty of evidence for it from many different languages. So it looks like quite a solid result. Same with Rizzi on the left periphery and so on. But there are a couple of problems, serious problems, which should lead us to recognize that it just can't be right. One problem, any linguistic theory is going to have to meet two conditions. This has been obvious for 60 years. Any theory, it wasn't true for structuralist theories because they were not attempting to find more than extremely superficial general properties of language. But if you're engaged in the project of generative grammar, trying to deal with the classic problem of how you can have an infinite array of structures coming from a finite object, your brain, which all have interpretations. If you're willing to engage that project at all, then you have two fundamental questions that you have to deal with. The question of learnability and questions of evolvability. So can it be learned? Obviously it is learned, so how can it be learned? Could it have evolved? Well, it did evolve, so how could it have evolved? Turning to the cartographic project, say Cinque's structures cannot possibly be learned. There's no conceivable evidence that a child could have that would lead to establishing these structures. You just don't have any evidence for them. I mean, you have to search hard to find evidence that bears on them. It's not in the environment of a child acquiring a language. And since it does appear to be universal, it seems to arise effectively without learning. So the learnability problem is severe, and the only possible answer to it is evolvability. It somehow must have evolved, and it's part of universal grammar. But you're facing the same question. How could anything like this ever have evolved? I mean, it's almost, you can't show that it's impossible, but it seems virtually unimaginable. So there's got to be some other basis for it. You have to try to see if you can find some other basis for this complex and very intriguing, fascinating collection of material, some other basis in more elementary principles that are available independently. And there have been a number of interesting attempts to do this. One right here, Jordi Fortuni's work, another careful analysis by, what's his name, Thomas Ernst, I think his name is, who wrote an very interesting book on adjuncts, in which he tried to show that there are general properties of adjuncts that would yield Cinque's cartography, and there are a couple of other approaches like that. But I think that's the right approach. It's quite remarkable work. It's very illuminating. It faces these two fundamental problems which have no answer on their own, learnability and evolvability, which leads us to seek deeper principles known elsewhere, which could yield these complex results, and there is interesting work in that direction. So I think that's my own view, is that's the way to look at it. It's very interesting research topics.
It's a related question. So when we try to derive cartographies from semantics, for instance, just to take an example, we appeal to semantic principles. Does it work? Yeah? But we do not know them independently. So they are very closely related to syntax. So there may be some danger there, because we may get into a vicious circle that we try to derive something from semantics, for instance, but we don't know semantics from independently. So how can we appeal to principles that we need to discover them in advance? Is it clear?
Did you get it?
No.
Yeah. It's very easy, yeah. More curta, well. So if you try to derive something from semantics, how do you know those principles independently? Because some way they are derived from syntax.
How do you know what?
How do you know those principles independently? No?
Did somebody get it?
Let's say we try to derive principles, well, let's say an observation about UG, whatever, like cartographies, any observation about UG.
About
UG.
UG?
Yeah. And then we appeal to some principle, let's say a semantic principle.
Yeah.
But we do not know anything about this. There is some danger there, trying to derive something that we know empirically from something that is a bit more obscure.
So could there be general semantic principles which would yield the cartography? Well, that's the approach that's been taken, plausibly. So if there are adjuncts that have sentential scope, let's say, and there are other adjuncts that have verb phrase scope, it's automatic under standard hierarchic principles that the one with sentential scope will be higher than the one with verb phrase scope. And the question is, can you account for the whole range of cartographic discoveries by invoking properties like this, which are independent? And the work that I mentioned is efforts to do this. It's similar. You might try similar things for the left periphery. I mean, are there some intrinsic reasons why, say, topic and focus should be arranged in a particular order, presumably semantic or pragmatic principles? That looks like the direction to go, and it is the direction that has been pursued by the people who've been trying to find a basis for that. So yeah, I agree. That's the plausible direction.
So, what is the place of optionality in grammar and its interaction with interface conditions imposed by pragmatic and semantic principles?
Well, this is a question that's been wrestled with since the earliest days. So, for example, say if you're at the stage of development of the theory where you're working with, say, move alpha, Lasnik-Saito's proposal, roughly late 1980s. So you've reduced the variety of transformational rules to move alpha. The question is the application of move alpha determined by some properties of the positions that are being related? So is movement triggered by a probe that has to be satisfied by the movement rule? Say, that's a typical question. One approach is to say, yes, everything has to be determined. The rules apply to satisfy certain conditions. Similarly, external merge, putting together two things to form a larger phrase. Is it triggered by the need to satisfy a theta rule, let's say? Is that generally the case for the way the architecture of the system works? That leads to efforts like crash-free grammar efforts to try to show that everything's determined in such a way that nothing ever crashes. That's one line of approach. Another line of approach is to say everything's optional. Rules just apply freely. And that'll, of course, give a lot of what's called overgeneration. But is that wrong, or is it right? Well, going back to the early days, like logical structure of linguistic theory, my assumption then is it's right. You should generate everything. Every string of elements does get some interpretation, a fixed interpretation usually, even sharply deviant expressions. In fact, deviant expressions are often exactly the right kind of expressions to use. So take metaphors. They're all semantically deviant. That's what makes them metaphors. If you say misery loves company, it's violating semantic selectional rules. There are many cases where innovations are used precisely because they're deviant. When Thorstein Veblen was talking about consumer culture and invented the phrase perform leisure, that has a special meaning because it deviates in a special way from grammatical rules. Some of them are, one of my favorites is an example of Rebecca West's. It was asked once what she thought about many world theories, like in semantics, and she said, one of the damn thing is enough. That radically violates grammatical rules, but it's exactly the right thing to say, and we interpret it correctly. So in fact, I think the language the internal language, in fact, does assign interpretations to things that deviate from grammatical principles, and those are often used, in fact. That leads to the suggestion that the rules really ought to be optional, that they just ought to apply freely, and they get whatever interpretation they have at the interface levels. That means that you want to understand the way the interface levels assign interpretations to things, but that's part of the nature of language. So my own feeling is that the right direction to move is towards optionality of rule systems. They just apply. They apply freely the way combinatorial rules do in other computational systems. There's no right or wrong about it, and they yield whatever they yield, and it gets whatever interpretation it does.
Okay, so question 6. Traditionally, much research has focused on locality constraints, but some linguistic phenomena show that globality is also relevant in accounting for certain phenomena. How can this tension be solved?
Well, this question is highly theory internal, unlike the others, which are quite general. So the tension arises in very specific theories, namely phase-based approaches to generation. There the tension arises. And it arises, I think, because of a misinterpretation, for which I'm responsible, of the notion transfer. Transfer is usually, I and others have described it as, for those of you familiar with these theories, as eliminating the elements of a phase and then moving on to the next phase. And then you perform things in the next phase and you eliminate those. You send them to the interfaces and so you go on. But then there are global phenomena, and that leads to a tension. The local phenomena are phase internal, but how do the global ones work if you've eliminated every piece as you went along? And I think that's the result of a serious misinterpretation of the notion transfer, which should not eliminate anything. And we have good reason to believe this. Actually, this is discussed in a thesis by Mikio Bata 5 or 6 years ago in Michigan. But the point is very simple. If you have, just take any phrase that includes within it a complete phase, let's say a clause. So take a phrase like the claim that, the verdict that Tom Jones is guilty. The verdict that Tom Jones is guilty. Internal to it, that Tom Jones is guilty is plainly a phase, if anything is. Suppose you were to eliminate that, and then the phrase, the verdict that Tom Jones is guilty, is moved to a higher position. So you get the verdict that Tom Jones is guilty seems to have been reached by the jury without due deliberation or something. How do you pronounce the phase that Tom Jones was guilty way up there, not down below where it was eliminated? Well, that doesn't make any sense. So what it means is that what is called spell out doesn't exist. What you have is just, and that transfer simply means identify a phase as closed and inaccessible to operations that might change something within it. That's what satisfies the computational motivation for phases. But nothing ever is gone, it all stays there. It's not gone, it's just that units, element, phase by phase are marked as you can't change me anymore. Okay, I'm fixed. But nothing changes. At that point, the tension between globality and locality disappears. Things are local if they're local, they're global if they're global. So condition C of the binding theory is going to play over the whole unit, no matter how complex it is. So I think the tension is a problem internal to a certain interpretation of phase theoretic approaches. And what you have to do is abandon that interpretation, which is wrong anyway, for the reasons I mentioned.
So question 7. What is the place of acceptability judgments in linguistic theory, And how do they relate to linguistic variation? How can we explain the fact that phonological and morphological factors like prosody, resumptive pronouns, ellipses, may ameliorate some syntactic violations?
Well, there are, when you begin to study some topic, it's just a mass of complex data. You don't know what belongs where. As you develop a degree of theoretical understanding, you begin to parcel out the phenomena into different areas and different dimensions and different factors. You may be doing it wrongly, but that's the only way to proceed. That's the way science proceeds. In this case, there is a fundamental difference between what's called competence and performance. The common internal system of common knowledge that's accessed by production and parsing and perception, and the input and output systems, the performance systems. Acceptability judgments have to do with performance. Of course, performance always accesses internal knowledge, so that's an element in performance, but only one element. There are many other elements in performance. When you get acceptability judgments, the subject is using all of the different dimensions that interact to yield the judgment. So, for example, memory constraints are going to affect acceptability. They don't affect the internal system, and these are topics that were studied 50, 60 years ago, and the results are there's still things that are not understood. So it takes simply the effect of memory on interpretability of expressions. So it takes embedding. George Miller and I showed 50 years ago that plain embedded expressions are interpretable up to the level of short-term memory, which is about what you'd expect. So up to the level of about 7. You can construct sentences with embedding as deep as maybe 6 or 7, and with not any particular difficulty, you can understand them. And that's what you'd expect. You can't go beyond short-term memory in carrying out a performance. So things beyond that level will be unacceptable, though they're perfectly grammatical. A very interesting result, still not really understood, is that self-embedding, like embedding a clause within a clause, that has a much narrower constraint. In fact, it doesn't go much beyond 2. If you try to get to self-embedding of 3, it becomes unintelligible, even though there's no memory restriction. So that raises a question, an interesting question for performance theories. What aspects of, what elements of our cognitive system are preventing self-embedding from going up to the level of short-term memory? When Miller and I discussed this, we talked about it in the metaphor of computer programs. If you're executing a certain routine, you can't call in that routine. If you're executing a relative clause routine, you can't call in the routine in the middle of it. That'll put a constraint on self-embedding. And maybe that's the right answer, maybe there's some other answer. But that's the kind of question that arises when you start looking at acceptability judgments. And there are many other things, like there are simple, it takes a heavy NP shift or extraposition or any of the operations that involve sort of the weight of an expression, which is sort of put off till the end. That doesn't have anything to do with grammaticality, with the properties of the internal system. It has to do with ways in which our memory and our perceptual systems are organized. So it's another dimension. And in fact, the rules that apply probably don't even belong within the core language. They have other properties, like extraposition or We've been putting them all together because we don't understand enough about the different systems that interact. But quite possibly these sometimes called stylistic transformations belong in the externalization system and not in the core computational system. And they involve factors like heaviness of expressions, which have no particular syntactic meaning. In fact, none, you know. There are questions of linear order, where you avoid certain concatenations for euphonic reasons. So it takes a verb particle constructions, like take the matter up, or make this up, let's say. You can have make up this solution, or make this solution up, take the problem up, or take up the problem. But you can't put these things together so that you get two occurrences of up at the end. See if I can make it work in my mind, but something like they made the decision to take the problem up. Okay, that's almost unintelligible, but it's perfectly grammatical. It just uses the extra position of up twice. You wouldn't do it, you would keep one of them inside. Well, that's a performance that yields unacceptability, but no ungrammaticality. And in general, acceptability is what you have to begin with, because until you know what you're doing, you just use whatever data there is. But acceptability is basically raw data, not categorized by the systems to which it is relevant. So therefore it involves all kinds of factors, memory, euphony, heaviness, all sorts of other things. And to progress in understanding the nature of the systems involved, you want to try to find ways to sort these things out and assign the data to the systems from which they derive. It's the same in any scientific endeavor, and this is a problem that we have here. As for the amelioration of syntactic violations, I presume it certainly happens, and I imagine, like say, resumptive pronouns. These are probably performance facts, which don't strictly belong within the computational system of language. It's not to say they're irrelevant, they're part of our whole linguistic behavior, but they just belong in some other compartment. That's a fair guess, I think.
So we move to question 8. So in the current version of the minimalist program, what are the theory internal restrictions that make it falsifiable?
Well, it's been hard to get this point across, even in the professional literature, but notice that the minimalist program is a program, and programs aren't falsifiable or verifiable. This is not a property of programs. Programs can be premature, they can be misdirected, all kind of comments you can make about they can be right, you know. A lot of things you can say about programs, but they can't be verified and they can't be falsified. They're not theories. They're just ways of approaching a topic. So the minimalist program can't be falsified. Particular proposals within it can be falsified and are all the time. Every time you open a journal, read the articles, they're falsifying some proposal that was made within the pursuit of the program. But that's a different matter. Okay, and somehow it's been really hard to get this point across. So there's lots of things in the professional literature which are arguing that the minimalist program is refuted or supported, or doesn't have enough evidence, or one thing or another. None of which, it's all category errors. You can't falsify programs or verify them.
So, Wilczko 2014 has argued that a universal categorical specification, that is, universal labeling, is impossible because languages may differ with respect to the categories, labels, unit types they express. Wilczko proposes instead that UG should be conceived as conforming only to a category-neutral hierarchical spine. Can you comment on the plausibility of a conception along these lines?
It goes on.
Oh, so, and again, sorry. It may appear to conform to minimalist desiderata, but it raises a number of questions about the learnability of a system where categorization is unrestricted. Grammatical categories are assumed to be language specific, and where the division between functional and lexical elements is blurred. So I guess the question is this one.
Well, the answer to this question is a matter of fact. You know, it's not a matter of opinion. So is it true or isn't it true? Or is Mark Baker right in his approach to categories, or is this right? But the question that arises at the end about minimalist desiderata goes back to the point I made before. Any approach is going to have to face questions of learnability and evolvability. This approach weakens the assumptions about innate structure. It says there's something weaker, therefore there's more to be learned. So it's going to have to meet learnability conditions. That's a problem that it's going to have to face, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, depending on whether the approach is correct. So the way to approach the question, I think, is to ask whether there is sufficient evidence that there are universal categories, say things like noun and verb, or whether there's just abstract forms that almost anything could fill in. Well, that you have to answer. My strong suspicion is that there are universal categories, but it's a question of fact.
So we move to question 10. Concerning ellipsis and its place in grammar, a very widespread view contends that ellipsis is syntactic in nature, whereas some others, including work of yourself with Howard Lesnick back in the 90s, argue that ellipsis should be regarded as a radical case of de-accentuation, thus placing ellipsis at the PF side of the grammar. How positive do you feel about the syntactic view of ellipsis?
If you take a look at the mass of cases of ellipses, almost all of them fall under de-accenting. There are exceptions, but the large, almost invariably, there's a de-accented analog to the ellipsis case. Try them out and see, which suggests that there is a fundamental principle that de-accents, and we basically know why. It has to do with pairing and focus and so on. And once you've de-accented, there's an option of eliminating. That would eliminate the question of ellipsis for that category of cases. Well, there are some other cases. So what's the right answer? My strong suspicion, this is a research topic, my strong suspicion is that the fundamental issue of ellipsis is de-accenting, which means ellipsis basically doesn't exist. But there are performance effects that do involve other kinds of ellipses, and they're going to have their own properties, which I suspect are around the periphery of the system. But that's that's a thesis, a proposal, which is either right or wrong, and you can investigate it. But I think it is quite striking that almost all of the cases of ellipsis do have a de-accented analog, which has to be accounted for. And once you've accounted for it, you've accounted for the ellipsis, which simply says delete the de-accented part.
So we move to question 11. What is your opinion on the application of minimalism to the acquisition of non-native languages?
I'm not sure what non-native languages means. What does non-native language mean? Second language acquisition. Well, first of all, what's minimalism? Okay. Minimalism is just science. Okay. So the question is, what's your opinion on the application of science to the acquisition of non-native second languages? Why is it called minimalism? You know, there's a reason why the term was used, although it's just a unbroken continuity from the earliest days of generative grammar, seamless change. It was, what happened is around the early 90s, it seemed to a number of people, me included, that enough had been learned so that it might be worth trying a different research approach instead of the earlier work from the very, as soon as the first, I mean, you have to go back a little bit to see what was going on. In the structuralist period, say the 1940s, when I was a student, it was assumed that everything is known, virtually. There aren't any problems. The only problem is to apply the methods of structural analysis to new languages. So a typical assignment when I was a student was take data from Cherokee and apply the methods of phonemic analysis to the data, and you get an organization of the data. And that's linguistics. It's the application of methods more or less known, maybe can be refined a little, to new data. In fact, this is so extreme at the time that there were very prominent linguists by around 1950 who had concluded that there's no point doing linguistic analysis anymore. The only thing to do is collect data, because computers are coming along and it'll be possible to program the methods, and then you just feed the data and you apply the methods. You get the organization, that's it. But there are no problems, fundamental problems, except fixing the data. As soon as the first attempts were made, primitive attempts, to construct generative grammars that actually tried to account for the infinite variety of expressions and the way they're interpreted and articulated, it immediately became obvious that the opposite is true. Nothing is known. Everything you look at is a problem. And that was quite a shock in a way. And the way to deal with it seemed to be to try to develop a series of generative grammar which were intricate and complex enough so that you could at least cover a lot of the data that was quickly being unearthed that hadn't been noticed before. So the early grammars are extremely complex. It was always understood that this can't be right for the reasons of learnability and evolvability. So efforts were made over the years to reduce the complexity. So reduce the complexity of phrase structured grammar to X-bar theory, for example, and keep going like that. And by the early 90s, it seemed, again, to a number of us that enough progress had been made so you could try a different approach. Namely, ask what would be a perfect system, and then ask how close does this come to accounting for the data. Now, that's the strong minimalist thesis. And that approach, that research approach, you can call minimalism. But remember, it's an approach. It's asking the question whether this approach yields interesting results. You can decide for yourself. I think it has yielded some quite striking results. But then the question is, can this approach tell us something about second language acquisition? I think it probably can, but that's a topic to investigate when you're looking at how second languages are acquired. Like, to what extent And there's a lot of, I mean, those of you who've worked in this area know there are many questions. So there are maturational effects, which are pretty general. It's by now fairly well established that there are a couple of sensitive periods, not quite critical periods. Going back to Lenneberg, he argued that there's a critical period for language acquisition, meaning a period in which you must acquire it or you're finished. And it's more likely that there are what are called sensitive periods. There are periods when the evidence more quickly and effectively leads to certain consequences. Others where it's much harder, and maybe it never totally does, but they're not strictly critical. And it looks like there are several such periods, age 3, age 6, puberty, and there's experimental evidence that you get differentiations depending on when a second language was acquired and depending on maturational properties. So that these questions to consider. There are questions about the extent to which a second language is tacked on to the first language, or whether it's simply picked up from the start, the way a child does using UG principles. And these are all quite interesting research questions. They have many complications. And you can ask whether the approach of seeking the minimalist research program of seeking to account for things by assuming that it's really the simplest possible system and then adding complexity as you're forced to, whether that's a useful research approach. I think that's the way the question shapes up as a normal question of science.
Question 12, well, you probably answered it, but assuming some version of phase theory, how does the system proceed to assemble the different pieces of a derivation, a process that is needed by PF and LF?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, this question goes back to one that we were talking about earlier. It's a question that arises within, in a highly, in theory, internal way, in terms of particular version of phase theory that interpreted transfer to mean eliminate, but that was wrong. And if we don't interpret transfer that way, rather we interpret transfer as just meaning close this off from further change, which again satisfies the computational motive, but then this question doesn't arise because everything's there, so no problems.
And this is actually related. So are there reasons to maintain the PIC, phase impenetrability condition, as an independent condition, or could it just be derived from cyclic spell-out of phase complements?
Well, this is the same answer. We have to get rid of spell-out because it doesn't make sense for the reasons I mentioned, like movement of a phrase that's already been spelled out. So if we eliminate spell-out, we're left with the PIC, the phase impenetrability condition. And questions then do arise. Like, for example, when we take the phase impenetrability condition, it says if some phase has been completed, you can't modify what's in it, but can you access what's in it? That's a factual question. A question arises. One of the cases, standard cases, is Icelandic. When you have a quirky nominative object, can it, and it's within a V star P, presumably a phase, but it does affect the inflectional element that's outside the phase. And does that mean penetration into a past phase without modifying anything, but just accessing something? And one approach is to say, yeah, that's allowed. Another approach, which was developed by Hisa Kitahara and others, is to to redefine the notion phase so it's all within a phase. These are the kinds of questions that can arise. You have the same questions arising for, say, the labeling algorithm. Can it label something deep inside, which doesn't change anything, just gives it a property? But these are all non-trivial research questions, I think. But spell out, I think, is just a mistake.
14 is also related to phase theory, the last one, related to that. So what are the problems, empirical and conceptual, of the proliferation of phases, say beyond C, V, little v, and D, and in particular the postulation of phases within the word?
Well, the case of D raises serious problems. Several problems. For one kind of problem, is it really D? I doubt that very much. It's been conventional to call nominal phrases DPs, but that doesn't make a lot of sense. D originally meant something. It meant determiner, like this or that. By now, D is simply used to mean whatever a nominal phrase has, even if it has no determiner. And that just loses the notion of determiner. These things should really be called nominal phrases, I think. And there are interesting approaches to how to reconstruct the notion of a nominal phrase so that it ends up being an N, with D just being some internal element that may or may not be there. There's a paper by Masa Oishi, which unfortunately is in a pretty inaccessible festschrift, but I'm sure you can get hold of it, which is, as far as I know, the most elaborate effort to work this out, raises other questions. So, and then what you find is that the second question is this entity, nominal phrase, seems to have some of the properties of phases, but lacks other properties of phases. So it seems in an ambiguous position, and it's not clear how to, at least to me, how to sort that out. I don't know what the answer is. Going beyond that, adding other phases simply adds all kinds of complications. I mean, the only basic property of phases is the impenetrability condition. If you don't have that, there's no point in phases. But if you make it smaller units, the impenetrability condition is going to force you to raise everything that's later changed out of the unit, right? And that just leads to madness as soon as you try to work it out. You have every little piece is being raised because later on it's going to be changed, and what's left, it doesn't make any sense. In fact, if you do that, there's really no point in having the notion phase. My strong suspicion is that we're going to end up with two phases, clausal and verbal, and probably that's related to uninterpretable features. There's a very curious fact about language, that they have uninterpretable features. Why should a language have an uninterpretable feature? So it doesn't add anything to the interpretation by definition. So what's it there for? And the only answer that's ever been suggested, to my knowledge, is that the uninterpretable features mark phases. There are uninterpretable features for CP and for VP, at least V star P, and maybe that's what they're there for, just to mark the phases. If there's another reason, I don't know what it is. They seem to serve no function within the linguistic system, and certainly not in the interpretive system by definition. So a kind of a guess is that that's something like what we're going to end up with when we understand enough. That leaves the question of nominal phrases in limbo. They seem to be a problem.
So if there's no question, we move to the last one, which is a very general question. David Hilbert famously came up with several fundamental problems for mathematics in 1900, which he presented in the International Congress of Mathematicians at the Sorbonne. What would you say are today's problems for linguistics as you understand it? And do you see avenues for research into them? They don't have to be 23, as conceived by Hilbert, or even 10, as he presented in the Congress. But it would be good if they are serious and, in your opinion, solvable, not mysteries.
Well, notice first that Hilbert formulated these problems in 1900. At that point, mathematics, which went back thousands of years to the Babylonians, had finally reached the stage where it had been literally formalized. Euclidean geometry wasn't formalized until about 1900, by Hilbert, in fact. Formal logic had been formalized by Frege not long before, and arithmetic by Peano not long before. But Hilbert was raising these questions at a time when a certain field of inquiry, which had been studied intensively for thousands of years, had finally gotten formalized. If you went back 50 years before that, 60 years before that, early in the 19th century, there were the mathematics was literally incoherent, not just unformalized, but incoherent. The core notion of analysis, calculus, limits, was a totally incoherent notion. It meant very small, but smaller than anything you can think of, but not zero. And what's that? If you take a look at Newton's proofs, they're defective, as was pointed out quite quickly, because in one line of the proof, zero means zero, and in another line it means as small as you can get. So, you know, the limit of something. And that's an equivocation which undermines the proof. In fact, there's a long history where continental and British mathematicians diverged in how to deal with this problem. The British mathematicians tried to solve the problem, and they didn't get anywhere. The time wasn't ripe to solve them. The continental mathematicians like Euler and others just ignored the problems, Gauss and so on, said, okay, it's incoherent, but let's go ahead anyway. And they developed all of the main modern mathematics. And finally, by about the mid-19th century, the incoherence was too much to deal with. You had to find a way out of it. And at that point, you get Lebesgue integration, delta epsilon proofs, the kind of stuff you now learn in calculus courses, and you solve the problems. A couple of years after that, arithmetic was formalized. Finally, Euclidean geometry was formalized. Finally, by 1900, you had a system that was clear and explicit enough so you could propose problems. That's mathematics. It hasn't happened in any other field. What you have in any other field is just problems, things you don't understand. Like in physics, how do you unify gravitational force and other forces? It's a problem. In linguistics, everywhere you look, there are problems. I mean, it's not as bad as it was in the 1950s, when every sentence you looked at seemed to be a problem. Or say the 1970s, when a major problem was what was called the free word order parameter. In the 1970s, it was assumed by the best linguists, people like Ken Hale, others, that German, Japanese had free word order. And obviously, Australian Aboriginal languages like Walbury, the famous case. So there seemed to be a real free word order parameter, and that was a huge problem. The later work showed that that's not the case, that these languages, including Walbury, have fixed word order, and it's the same, it's not word order, it's fixed hierarchic structure. And they're basically the same as others. You get Mark Baker's work on polysynthetic languages, brings it together with that. So these problems got resolved in quite interesting ways, but there are plenty of new ones waiting. In fact, all over the place there are problems, but I don't think you can list them in the way that Hilbert was able to do at a point in the development of mathematics where it had finally, after thousands of years, become a coherent set of ideas, not totally by any means, because the set theoretic paradoxes quickly arose after Hilbert, and those are unsolved. So by now, it's unclear whether set theory, which is the fundamental, the basis of modern mathematics, has a coherent account. Intuitionists would claim it doesn't. So more problems. But in the case of a field like linguistics, we're just in the very early stages, even of trying to decide where problems fall. So does, say, heavy NP shift fall within a merge-based system of core computation, or is it part of the performance system? Even questions like that, we don't really know the answer. I can have guesses, but you don't know the answer. Questions of cartography. In fact, just about everything that's come up today are problems that ask for solutions, and it's not always, often not obvious where to look, you know. So I don't think it's really possible to carry out something like the Hilbert program, 1900 Hilbert program.
Okay, so let's thank Professor Noam Chomsky, please. And also, thank you for Ángel Gallego, the main organizer of this event, and Eulalia Bonet for her great job.